So welcome. We've got Andy Robertson from Woodland Croft is going to help us this evening with looking at the topic of seed gathering. And I'm just going to cover some little bits of information before that, just to put it in the Fife context. This is part of Climate Action Fife, and there's a partnership there of all these community groups, and I'm hosted with Fife Coast and Countryside Trust, but I work for the Climate Action Fife project. So this is all these community groups coming together with some big ambitions to try and encourage everyone in Fife to think about what they can do to be more climate friendly. So whether that's in their gardens, their business, the way they travel to work, their food, and their homes, or whether it comes to the community tree planting or natural environment, which is obviously what I'm heading up. So there is a big ambition in Fife to plant trees. It's a high priority for communities and communities generally. I'm not saying not everyone in the communities, but generally would support tree planting. So they obviously recognise that it helps to mitigate for climate change, and it's tackling things like flooding, helping with biodiversity and health and recreation. So there is a big ambition, and you know we talk about this tree for every person in Fife being planted as part of that big ambition. So why grow trees? So obviously we clearly want to realise that community ambition and realise all those benefits that we have from trees in terms of biodiversity and for health benefits for us as people. We also need to think about how growing our own trees will help with climate resilience, so we can be careful about the species that we choose to grow. We could increase some of the rare native species that we have, so we can grow particular trees. We can choose where that seed comes from. So, you know, we're recommending that you collect Fife-based seed, and Andy's going to talk us through some of the legal stuff around what you need to do about collecting seed later this evening. But yeah, we can be growing some of those rare native species in Fife that maybe aren't, that's something that we can increase. And obviously growing locally means that they'll be more likely. So if we grow local seed, they will be our provenance, they'll be Fife-based, and they will hopefully thrive in Fife as well and thrive better. They'll hopefully be more resistant to pests and diseases as well. And we are starting to see issues with stock. So that's in terms of trying to buy trees from commercial nurseries. We are seeing some issues sometimes with the stock running out. So what we're hoping is that everyone that's involved in gathering their own seed and growing it, obviously wonderful if you're wanting to do that to plant in your own gardens, but what we're hoping to encourage people to do is actually to grow on allotments or in their gardens for community spaces as well, so that we've got this stock available for community planting. Because as we want to ramp up that ambition of planting in communities, we need to have more trees. And part of that does come down to that last point there, which is about costs. So obviously us gathering the seed and growing it, it's your time investment, which we really value and appreciate, and we're not having to then go and buy trees as well. The other one, I suppose, as well, is that we could maybe grow trees on so they're a little bit older when we put them in. A lot of our trees come from the Woodland Trust, which is fantastic. We get free tree packs. That's about 80 or 90% of our community tree planting is through provision of Woodland Trust free packs, which are great, but they are usually very small trees, and we don't therefore see such a high survival rate. So, you know, if we're growing in our communities, we could grow them a little bit larger so they have an extra chance of survival as well when they're planted out. So when we're thinking about what trees for Fife, this can be a discussion. This is a discussion. This is not Rebecca's edict. This is just about us thinking about the species that we have in Fife already. We want to think, when you're thinking about growing, you want to think about native and naturalised trees that we have, but also think about the non-natives as well, because they're going to possibly flourish in more urban areas. So, you know, we're obviously trying to encourage native growing as much as possible, but we aren't being exclusive to that we are also looking for non-natives too. And we're also looking for this mix of species from the shrub layer up to the sub-canopy and up to the canopy layer as well. So just as those pictures are sort of are highlighting there, we've got some at the shrub layer, and then we're going up to sort of more canopy level as well. So we've got the aspens of the world and the poplars. We've got a black poplar there and a small leaf lime. We've got a field elm. And oh goodness, I wonder, this has gone out of my head for the moment, but wayfaring tree, that's what it is, and the lovely rose there on the left. So we're looking at all those different layers. We're thinking about natives and naturalised trees and non-natives, and we're possibly thinking about not growing some that maybe we wouldn't want to be planting as much. So this is where Andrew calls me a purist, but horse chestnut's quite a big tree. They are quite easy to propagate, but it's a big tree. So when we're looking at community planting, it's not often somewhere that I can find sites within communities where we can grow horse chestnuts because they just get so big. The same with beech. In a woodland, it does, it takes over quite a lot, and not a lot will flourish underneath the beech. So we're not actively planting beech. Same with sycamore. Well, actually, sycamore and birch are fine trees in their own way, and absolutely should be encouraging. Birch is a pioneer species and will often be the first thing that will grow in a new site. So we don't often need to grow them because they're the sort of things that would appear and would grow quite easily themselves. So it's not a kind of we don't like these trees. It's more about the different things that we could grow that would really benefit biodiversity and create that sort of real biodiverse mix, which is going to help us with the pests and diseases and with climate resilience going forward as well. So on that, we've got the tree planting palette in Fife, which I will send you a link to after the sessions this week and next week, which just identify the types of trees that you could plant or the recommended. This was produced, I believe, by the Botanic Gardens, and Rural Skills Scotland, I think, were also involved in creating this, and St Andrews University. So it's got these different habitats, and it's got recommended trees as well that you would be looking to plant in those habitats, and it identifies the canopy types as well. So whether it's shrub or edge or subcanopy or the canopy there. So and it also gives you the kind of proportions that they recommend and the number of trees that comes down to. So if you were growing your own, you could kind of grow that to orders kind of thing. So yeah, this is a useful guide. It's going to be updated soon, actually, because the science is emerging all the time about what trees to grow, particularly around sort of climate modelling. So this will be a little bit updated, but it's a great resource. And we've got our seed zones there for Fife, which are 203, but we could also be looking at East Coast neighbouring zones as well, because as our climate changes, we can be looking at our neighbours' tree zones as well. And I'm sure Andy will explain a little bit more about that. So just for me to finish, before I introduce Andy, Andy's going to sort of now talk us through the rest of the evening. I just wanted to mention a great project that one of our tree wardens has been involved in. He was actually doing this project before he became a tree warden. He's collected over 200 seed oaks, acorns, and he's grown those on, and he's now, as part of a public artwork, is now growing this forest across Fife and putting these akin oaks on a map. So a wonderful example of just one person collecting lots of seed, and he grows them on his allotment, and then he grows them on, and then they get planted, which is fantastic. Just to hopefully inspire you. So what I'll do now is I'll just stop sharing while Andy boots up his slides, but I'll just then, while Andy's doing that, I'm just going to talk you through what the outline for the rest of the evening is. So I've just gone through why grow trees and what trees to grow in Fife. And Andy's now going to kind of go through an overview of sort of his growing. He's got over 20 years of experience of growing trees, 3 years of that commercially, so he'll touch a little bit on that. We are mostly kind of community groups and 5 tree wardens on this group, so we're not looking to grow commercially as such, but I'm sure there'll be things that we could ask you about that. So Andy's going to just talk us through some of the legal stuff, and then he's also going to talk about how we would go about collecting some seed.
This year I've got about 35,000 trees at various stages of growth, producing to sell about 15 or 16,000 this year. I started collecting seed on mull about 25 years ago, and just growing on quite a small scale, maybe a few hundred trees a year, just in fish boxes and pots. Just a few more drone photos of the croft there to give you a bit of context. Yeah, that's a view from a couple of years ago. I've actually got some new drone photos. I've got another polytunnel now, so it's expanded a bit. Those are the beds in the garden where I grow some vegetables, and in rotation with mainly oak and hazel in open beds for 2 years. That's just another view of the garden. Are you seeing this all right, Rebecca?
Yeah, all good, Andy. Yeah, it's great.
Okay, good. Yeah, just let me know if things stall, or they don't seem to be moving on. That's last year in the polytunnel, probably early summer, late spring, early summer. Mostly hazel you're seeing there, and oak with a few other bits and bobs. That's a view from the other end. I use the foldable root trainers, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, although I've moved on to other growing cells now. These are vole-proof boxes where I put oak and have them covered with rodent mesh until they start growing, and then I can take that off and let them get away. They're not quite so vulnerable once they've sprouted and they're growing, but certainly in the early season and over the winter, they're very vulnerable to mice and voles. Anyway, I'm going to talk more about growing techniques next week. So that's just to give you a bit of an overview. I'm going to talk briefly about the legalities. I don't want to get bogged down in that. It's very, very boring. I'm registered with the forestry, Scottish Forestry, for FRM, and that means I register my seed collections 2 weeks in advance, and then there's paperwork involved for traceability, and I have to apply for master certificates once I've collected the seed, and then provide suppliers documents. This is only really applicable for grant-aided schemes legally, I think. So because I sell mainly to community woodland projects, they require this paperwork from Scottish Forestry. But having said that, I registered a few years ago before I was selling at any scale, and it was quite good just to get into the system and get used to registering all my seed collections. I'm also registered for plant passports. Again, you might not need to do this depending on what level you're doing things at. If you're just growing trees to plant, locally for voluntary schemes and that kind of thing, and you're not selling them, then you probably don't need them, but it's worth giving them a call and checking. And I'm also registered for the Woodland Trust UK ISG, which is an accreditation for them, a voluntary accreditation, so I can sell stuff to the Woodland Trust as well. So they've got quite a few projects on Mull, which I provide relatively small numbers of trees for, up to 800, 1,000 or so trees at a time. So I'll talk through my experience of growing the species I grow. I grow most of the species that are native to Mull, apart from the willows, the native willows. I grow most of the other broadleaf species. I noticed from Rebecca's list of your species profile, there's quite a few that I don't have much experience with there. So hopefully some of this is transferable for sort of general techniques anyway. So the first species of the year really for me is wych elm, which I start collecting early to mid-June. There's a really lovely big elm tree, probably one of the best elm trees on the island. Actually, that tree very rarely produces much seed, but it is a cracking tree. We've got some lovely elm trees, luckily, on Mull. I haven't been too affected by the Dutch elm disease. So I try and collect the seed when it's starting to turn brown, going from green to brown. If I'm going to just try and zoom in, does that work for you, Rebecca? Can you see that?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I can see it clearly now.
So the seed most years is in quite big bunches, which is great, but quite often a lot of the seed is empty. So I find that I'm collecting big bundles, big bagfuls of seed, and you squeeze the middle of the seed, and it feels empty. This is a moth larvae. I can't remember which one it is specifically, that feeds on the seed and eats a lot of the seed before it matures. So what I tend to do is collect a lot and sow it very thickly, usually in a fish box, sow it maybe about 1 inch thick, and then cover with sharp sand, and that'll germinate usually within about 3 weeks. And I use these nice sort of net bags, which I think I bought off Amazon, but breathable bag. It's quite good for this type of seed, so it doesn't sweat inside of the bag. And try and collect these kind of seeds on a dry day as well. Yeah, I mean, with buried seeds like rowan and hawthorn, doesn't really matter if it's pouring rain. I was out yesterday in the pouring rain collecting sloes, and but for birch and elm and these drier seeds, it's better on a dry day. I would say as well, when you're collecting seeds, try and collect from as many trees as possible to get that genetic diversity, and try and find wild woodland, especially for the native species, rather than going to estate woodlands or parks or gardens. If you can find remnants of ancient semi-natural woodland, that kind of thing, you're going to get truly native trees. And then after June, coming into the end of July, I start to collect bird cherry and wild cherry. That's bird cherry. Yeah, it's not a species I grow a lot of. It's quite easy to process, to clean the flesh off it, and then I'll store that in sand over winter and sow in the spring. Doesn't really need any pre-treatment in my experience. Just going back to the elm, that's one of the few seeds that I would sow straight away. It wants to germinate pretty quick after you've collected it, and it doesn't store very well in my experience. I think you could probably try storing it in the fridge over the winter. Some other people might have experience of that. I always just sow it straight away. Okay, birch. There's some nice birch shield bugs there. Not the best picture in the world, I'm sorry. I did notice that Rebecca said she's not that keen on people growing birch, so I'm not going to dwell too much on birch. I do grow quite a lot of downy birch and a bit of silver birch. We've mostly got downy birch on Mull. There is some silver, and it hybridizes quite easily, so I try and collect trees that are showing distinct characteristics. I'm not going to go too deeply into the differences between silver and downy birch, but yeah, if you're collecting from something that looks definitely like a downy birch or definitely like a silver birch rather than a maybe kind of hybrid, then I think that's a bit safer. And I collect the seed. You can collect it when it's quite green. You see the one in the middle there. It's not really started to go brown, but it's fine to collect it like that. It's easier, and then you can just dry it once you've collected it. And I dry it at room temperature and store it in the fridge over winter before a pre-treatment in the spring, and sowing in early mid-March. It's quite an easy, quick seed to collect. I don't usually have to spend much time to collect a lot of birch seed. You can get a nice big bag full in an afternoon if you find some good seed trees. It's not a bad seed year this year for birch. That's a typical example of a downy birch leaf, and then this is a silver birch leaf, more deeply toothed and more triangular. But as I say, there are plenty of hybrids in between, so identification is not always that difficult. You've probably got more silver birch on the East Coast, being drier over there. Rowan doesn't need much introduction, usually in abundance at this time of year. I collect rowan from the beginning of August, really, if it's ripe enough, but there's still plenty on the trees now here. It's starting to disappear. I haven't seen big flocks of fieldfares and waxwings coming in yet for it, but yeah, I collect about 10 kilos of that every year. It's actually one of the most difficult buried seeds to process. I used to spend hours and hours and hours trying to clean the seed as much as possible to get as much of the flesh off. But I found that it's not time well spent, really. What I do now is I mash it up and wash it as much as I can in a short period of time, and then store it in sand outside for 18 months, and then sow it in the second spring, if you like, and not worry about trying to get better germination in the first spring. This is an example of some washed rowan seed. It involves floating off the pulp and mashing it up, you know, repeated times and letting the seed sink to the bottom. I'm sure some of you have done this before. Relatively easy in small quantities, but when you're doing a lot of it, it uses a lot of water. And as I say, if you just put it outside to stratify in buckets, nature will take its course, and you should get good germination in the second spring. It's one of the seeds that a lot of small nurseries send away for processing. They'll get a bag of maybe 30 or 50 kilos and send it away to Forest Start in England, and they'll process it for you and send you back seed in the spring the following year, ready to sow with a good germination rate. But it's not something I've done so far, but I might consider that in the future. There's the very clean seed weighed. What's that, 125 grams? I can't remember how many berries yielded that many, but it would have been quite a lot. And then moving on to hazel, I start collecting hazel usually at the beginning of September, although this year it seemed to ripen a bit early, I would say 10 days, 2 weeks early. So I missed the boat on a lot of it. A lot of it has fallen from the trees now, and I'm struggling to find any, but I've probably got about 25 kilos of clean hazelnuts. I don't collect the seed off the ground. Quite often the first seed that falls from the trees is empty, and if the rodents have left it for any length of time, it usually means that they're empty as well. So it's best to collect it off the trees, and if the nut is coming away from the husk, that means it's nice and ripe. But I quite often collect it when it's quite green, and just dry it out in racks until the seed comes away from the husk, the nut comes away from the husk. That's me with crates drying them out. I think that was last year. Quite a good harvest of hazelnuts. I think I got about 35 kilos of nuts, which translated into about 7,500 trees the following year, and a relatively easy tree to grow if you can keep squirrels and rodents away from it. Luckily, we don't have any squirrels here, and every time somebody talks about introducing red squirrels to Mull, I break out into a bit of a cold sweat. But I know on the mainland you'll have a lot of problems with grey squirrels, especially in some parts. So yeah, I get the seed out of the husk and let it dry a little bit, not too dry, obviously. And then late autumn, I mix them with sand and drill some holes in the bottom of these sheep lick buckets, which are an abundant waste over here. The farmers just have tons of them and they want to get rid of them. So I've got as many of those as I want, and I can stack them up into each other, and that creates a rodent-proof system. They can't get in between the gap there, and I keep them in a cool shed over the winter and check them periodically to make sure they're not drying out, which they don't really. I might splash a bit of water on them occasionally. This year I might just do it with spent compost instead of sand, just so they'll be a bit lighter to move around. But sharp sand works fine in my experience. And then the following year, from about the beginning of March, I will start going through them, and as they start to chit, as the radical root starts to emerge, I'll sow them into root trainers or pots in the following spring. So yeah, and I'll go through them maybe once a week, picking out any that have germinated. But I'll talk more about the actual sowing and growing of the trees next week. Yeah, so that's hazel. I've pretty much stopped collecting hazel now for the year. I might get a bit more. Acorns, yeah, it's a fantastic year for oak on Mull this year. It wasn't so great last year. Yeah, a lot of trees are really heavy with acorns, and again they do seem to be ripening a little bit earlier this year, like the hazels. We've had quite a few gales and high winds over the last 10 days or so, so although I don't usually start collecting them till like October, I have been going out and collecting any that have fallen. I try and collect the larger ones, although the smaller ones seem to grow pretty much as well. I haven't done any scientific studies on whether the big ones make a bigger seedling, but I think they do. You know, there's more energy in that acorn, so yeah. And I do collect them off the tree. If the acorn is coming away cleanly from the cup, again, like the hazels, if it comes away from the cup and it breaks off at the bottom of the acorn, then I know that it's not ripe enough, and I'll leave them a bit longer. It'd be nice if I had a picture of that, but I don't. This is not the best photo again. This is from a couple of years ago, actually, later in the season, and you can see they're actually germinating on the trees. It was mild and damp, and yeah, you quite often see that a bit later in the season. They will start to germinate on the trees, and they'll certainly start to germinate when they're on the ground. And for that reason, I sow a lot of them soon after I collect them, because they're very prone to drying out. Once they start to wrinkle and dry out, they lose a lot of their viability. So it's good to store them in maybe damp compost or leaf litter until you're ready to sow them. And in practice, you can store them through the winter, as long as you check them now and again and move them around, make sure they're not going mouldy, and make sure they're not drying out. I used to worry quite a lot about breaking off the end of the root, the radical, when I was potting them, but I've since learned that that's not necessarily a problem, because they will start to send out strong lateral roots if you break the end off the root. So yeah, just be careful not to break too much off. There's a nice bucket of acorns from the other day. Just drying them out there in trays a little bit. And on to blackthorn, which I was just out collecting today, actually. I start collecting those probably the beginning of September if they're ripe enough. When they've got that sort of, what do you call it, that bloom, that matte kind of colour on them, I know that they're pretty much ripe. Just give them a feel and try and get in there before the birds and the people picking sloes for sloe gin. Yeah, and as you can see, lots of lovely lichen on the trees there. They're quite slow growing, no pun intended. So yeah, with a nice clean air on the west coast, you get some lovely lichens on some of the sloe bushes. So yeah, I'll pick those as they're ripening. Obviously, watch out for thorns. As a bit of a close-up, and then these ones have gotten quite nice and mushy. Let them, leave them in the bucket for a while, and you can let them rot a bit, but I'd be wary of letting them rot too much. Apparently, any kind of fermentation of this flesh on seeds can inhibit germination a bit. So it helps to clean them if you let them rot a bit. I actually found today, going out, a lot of the sloes were swelling up and bursting because we've had so much rain in the last couple of weeks. It's like overwatering your tomatoes, if you like. You know, they just start to split with the amount of water they're getting. So that'll actually make them easier to clean. And that's some very nice clean seed. I've probably spent far too long cleaning that. I just mash them up in a bucket and then repeatedly wash them with a hose pipe. It's one of the easiest seeds to process and clean, much easier than rowan. So I've no problem doing that myself. And then over the winter, you could probably put it in the fridge as it is, or you can put it outside in buckets and stratify with a mixture of sharp sand and compost for sowing it the following spring. I find that blackthorn germinates pretty well after just one winter of stratification. I tend to, with half the batch, I will mix with compost and perlite, make a damp mix, and then keep it at room temperature until New Year, and then put it in the fridge until March, and then start having a look to see if any of the seeds are starting to sprout, and if so, either pot them directly into pots or root trainers, or sow them into seed trays for pricking out later. I don't know how we're doing for time. I've got probably plenty of time. I'm racing ahead. I'm finding this quite difficult because I'm not getting any feedback from anybody. I'm not used to it. Can you still hear me, Rebecca?
It's all good. Thank you, Andy. Yeah, wonderful.
Okay, yeah. I'm more used to doing these kind of things in person and getting the blank stares and the occasional grunt. But hawthorn, yeah. I started to collect some hawthorn today as well. That's yeah, much the same as sloes, actually, a bit more time consuming to pick it. I find it stays on the bushes for quite a long time, depending on the bird's pressure, and you can be picking hawthorn pretty much most of the winter in places. Again, it's quite easy to clean. Just mash it up and wash the flesh off it. It is a seed that takes a bit longer to germinate, and I can do the process of storing at room temperature mixed with sand and with perlite and compost until New Year, and then putting in the fridge till March, and I get a slightly better germination in the first spring, but I find in practice most of it won't germinate until 18 months later. So what I do with hawthorn now is I'll do that, leave that in buckets outside. Sorry, I'm just going off screen a second to see quite how much more I've got to go. Because I am racing ahead a little bit. If anybody's got any questions at this point, it might be good to take any of those.
There was just something I put in here about getting landowners' permission for collecting seeds.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that, actually. I have got a list I should have mentioned. Yes, it's pretty essential to get landowners' permission. It's certainly essential if you're registered with the FRM scheme. I've actually got an inspection next month for somebody will come and monitor the seed collection, and they will ask to see any landowner permissions. It can just be a copy of an email or something I can show them. But yeah, I mean, in practice, I've got permission from a few of the estates on Mull, and that covers me for everything, for all the seed I need to collect. But it's always worth having a word with the landowner, and you know, they might be interested in what you're doing, and it might be a way to sell some trees to them and make a contact there. And most people, with one notable exception, I find have been very, you know, friendly and interested and amenable to me collecting seed. So yeah, there's no problem with that, really. And if you're a community group, especially, they'd always be happy to help, I think. So yeah, once I've collected the buried seeds, the hawthorn and the blackthorn, and I've got the acorns and hazelnuts sorted out, I'll move on to alder. And you can see here they've actually started to go quite brown, and once they go brown and they open up, a lot of the seed starts to fall. You can pick them when they're a little bit greener. But yeah, so sort of keep an eye on them. The ripening will vary a lot from tree to tree or from wood to wood. So I'll start to collect that probably from about mid-October, but it might be quite different where you are. So it's worth keeping an eye on the trees. And then I'll keep it at room temperature and let it dry out a bit. And then something like a colander, I can shake the small seeds out of the cones, and I'll probably do that repeatedly over a few weeks, and keep going through them and shaking, and they'll release more seed. And then once I've got the seed out, I'll zoom in a bit there, I can put that through a fine sieve and get rid of all the dust from the seed, and that gives you nice clean seed. And much like birch, I can store that over the winter in the fridge, or yeah, best stored dry over winter in the fridge, and then I will do a pre-treatment in February, like I would do with birch, before you sow it. And holly is yeah, that's a very slow one. Quite often it will take 3 years to germinate. I've never tried growing it from cuttings, but it's something I will try from cuttings. But I find if I collect a good load every year and I'll have seed trays sitting for a number of years, eventually some will germinate. So, you know, this year I will have stuff germinating from 2 or 3 years ago, and then keep those seed trays because they'll keep germinating a few for a number of years. And juniper, yeah, that's another very slow one, if not a lot slower than holly. We've got the prostrate dwarf juniper here, which grows very low to the ground, and it's one seed I can actually collect all year, because they ripen very slowly. So you'll find on one bush there'll be a few green, there'll be a few ripe, there'll be a few overripe. So it's something I tend to do in the depths of winter when there's not many other seeds to collect. I'll have a wander around and collect a few handfuls of juniper berries just to keep me busy in the winter months. Okay, so this is an example of what I do with my birch and alder seed. The alder seed is the darker of the two seeds there. It's the larger seed, but in practice I pretty much treat them the same way: alder, silver birch and downy birch. So I'll soak them for 24 hours at room temperature and then drain them, and then the following day I will mix them with sand or compost, or a mixture of the two, about 50-50. You just want something that's going to hold the moisture, and then put them in the fridge in a breathable bag, or I would use a yogurt pot or something with some holes punched into the top, just so it's just moist, so you can not quite squeeze the moisture out of it. You know, it's not dripping wet, and it's not too dry. And just check on those every week, make sure they're not going mouldy, give them a stir, and then sow them after about a month. So you'd start the treatment in mid-February and then sow them in mid-March. And yeah, that just gives you a more even germination, a more consistent germination, I find. You can sow it dry and it works quite well, but you might get germination spread out further in the spring rather than getting a nice even germination with this with this pre-treatment. And then again, that's alder on the left and birch on the right. Yeah, just to go back to that. So to sort of summarize the seeds that I do, I would put them into 3 categories, if you like. The buried seeds, which need cleaning before pre-treatment and before stratification. So that's rowan, hawthorn and blackthorn. And the bigger seeds like acorns and hazelnuts, which really don't need much treatment, but the acorns will start germinating relatively quickly, and the hazel can be kept till the following spring and then sown as they sprout in the spring. Birch and alder, which can be stored dry, and the wych elm, which is sown straight away. I also grow aspen, but that's a whole nother subject, and I grow that from root cuttings. I've got lots of slides on aspen, but I'm not going to talk about that today. That's a bit more complicated. Some of you might have experience growing aspen from cuttings, and yeah, that's worth a whole event in itself, I think. So the beginning of last year, I was still in the fairly early stages of the tree nursery, and I was asking a lot of questions about all sorts of things, growing trees and seed processing. So I set up this Facebook group, the Scottish Small Tree Nursery Network, and this has I think we've got over 470 members now from all over the country, not just Scotland, but all over the UK. So it's a good place to come and ask questions, whatever it is, whether it's just about different growing containers or composts or fertilizers or anything at all. It's free to join, but it is something you have to join. You can't just look at it without joining. So if you drop a message there, you can join that and network with other people doing similar things. And that's my page, the Woodland Crofter Facebook page, where I update on general croft things and what I'm doing in the nursery. And the Mull Aspen project, which is sort of a side project of my tree nursery. I wish I had more time to spend on the aspen project, but it's quite labour intensive. I'm basically trying to collect cuttings from all the different aspen clones on Mull and create a cuttings orchard, if you like, growing different cuttings in air pots, and that kind of thing. I've actually run out of slides because I've rattled through them.
That's wonderful, Andy. That's brilliant timing as well. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Is it brilliant timing? I felt like I kind of rushed the first half and then.
No, it's absolutely brilliant. And we've got a few questions in the chat box, which I'll come to. But yeah, I would definitely like to take you up on aspen as maybe a discrete session, because in Fife, that's one of our priority tree species as part of our LBAP. And yeah, so really interested in kind of learning a little bit more about that as a process, and particularly the what you were saying there about the clones and the what did you call it, a library, was it? No, what was it?
Like
collection.
An orchard. Are you aware
orchard,
of
that was it, orchard.
The Scotland the Big Picture has started this Painting Scotland Yellow campaign, which is all about aspen?
No.
No, if you go onto their website or their Facebook page, hashtag Painting Scotland Yellow, and it's all about raising awareness about aspen and enabling nurseries to grow more aspen. And I think they were talking about holding some sort of workshop, maybe at Trees for Life in Dundregan, who, as some of you probably know, they did a lot of pioneering work with aspen, and it was working with them in the 90s actually that really got me into aspen and everything that they did. But they're doing some great stuff with aspens in polytunnels and grafting and getting them to seed by stressing them and all that kind of thing. So it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, no, wonderful. I think we should definitely look at doing a session on that, or fitting in with another session that's being organised. I'll just looking at the chat box here of some other sort of things that people have mentioned.
Did I stop sharing my screen? Or
yeah, no, that's great. So someone here has posted about collecting. So this is about fruit tree growing. I don't know if that's something you have any experience of, Andy, directly, but so there was a query here about collecting seeds to grow fruit trees. So my understanding is that they're better propagated with rootstock and taking, cuttings and yeah, but I don't know if there's any success of growing it from seed or
yeah. I'm afraid I don't have much experience with fruit trees. It is something I'd like to get into, but in the main, grafting onto rootstocks is best, I think. Depending on the it's not something I've got much experience with.
No, we can double check on that one, but we have got some sort of fruit tree propagation stuff. And if anyone on the call's got expertise on that as well, but that's my understanding as well, is that we're looking at fruit tree propagation. And we do have the Fife's Fruit Tree in Every Garden campaign that's launching this autumn. So keep your eyes peeled out for that. That's encouraging, people to plant a fruit tree in their garden. And we have some free trees to give away and asking people to make donations to those as well. So I've got another one here about I planted lots of wych elm seeds and planted in seed trays at the end of June. Nothing has germinated. What do I do differently?
Well, like I said, a lot of the seed tends to be empty, and it'll vary from tree to tree and year to year how much of that seed is actually viable. I would say you might have been unlucky. You might just need to collect a lot more seed, in future. You might find some of it will come up next year. I mean, I usually hold over my seed trays till the following year, and there'll be a few more come up the following year. So hang on to them. You might get some next spring.
Okay, that's great advice. Pre-treatments, is there anything? There was a question here, I think that was before you went into pre-treatments. Is there anything else you might want to share with us about pre-treatments? So someone's put here, what are the pre-treatments? But that's mainly the dry seeds, I think you were talking about, with hazel and alder and birch.
The only seeds I pre-treat are hawthorn, blackthorn, birch and alder. So with the hawthorn and the blackthorn, I will mix with sand and compost 50-50, a damp mix, and then put it in the fridge. Some people say that you can, if you alternate between room temperature and in the fridge and then keep swapping them around every couple of weeks, you can get better germination, but I haven't really experimented with that very much. And then with the birch and the alder, I do the pre-treatment about 4 weeks before I sow it. So I'll pre-treat it about mid-February. There's quite a lot of Guelder rose, that's a good question. There's quite a lot of information online about various seed pre-treatments, and I'll put some links into that when I email you, Rebecca, all the other resources.
Fantastic.
Guelder rose, something I only collected for the first time last year, and I'm told that the seed will germinate in the first year but won't actually emerge from the seed tray, so you need to keep it for 2 years. So if you've got seed now, you clean it and put it in a seed tray or put it in a pot, and then it should sprout the following spring, but it won't actually start to grow until the spring after, if that makes sense. But as I say, it's the first time I've grown it, so I don't really know. I'm hoping the stuff I sowed last year will actually come up next spring. It's a lovely tree to grow, Guelder rose. Yeah,
that's what I was thinking. But it was very smelly as well to process.
Yes, no, it is.
The berry is really quite toxic. There was another question. So the one was a point of clarification for myself about, yes, please do grow birch. It was more if there was a natural seed source that might not be as needed as they propagate well. So if you've obviously got a site where there's lots of, so they do propagate well, but it's please do grow birches, particularly downy. But they're a good tree to grow. I don't know if anyone else has got any other questions just before we move on, for anything else from Andy.
I would say, you know, for that reason, I don't really grow the native willows, because I find they seed so readily in any areas that are, you know, clearfelled or waste ground, or as long as they're not being grazed, they do seed quite well themselves. And it's quite a fiddly one to grow, the willows, but it's something I might try next year. And it seeds at a time when I'm usually really busy with other things, so it'll seed in the late spring, early summer, and I'm usually very busy pricking out other seedlings in the nursery, and I'm not focused on collecting seed.
So we've got one here. Does holly just get sown direct in compost medium?
You can do, and I found that does work quite well. What I did last year on advice, I collected the seed over the winter and then cleaned it really well, cleaned all the flesh off, and then mixed again with a substrate of compost and sand, or compost and perlite, something like that. And then I kept that at room temperature for 6 months, and then I've now put that in the fridge. That was in the fridge from midsummer, and I'm told that it should start to germinate in the fridge in the winter sometime. So I'll go back and check the seed in the winter regularly in the fridge, and if it started to sprout, I will then sow those seeds either in a seed tray, or if I've got time, I'll sow them into individual modules in module trays. So we'll see what happens there. In the past, I've just sown it in a seed tray and left it to do its own thing, and it comes up when it comes up.
And what's perlite? What does that do?
Perlite is it's a volcanic substance, I think, and it aerates the soil and the compost and retains moisture as well. You can buy it in quite big bags. Perlite or vermiculite or sharp sand works quite well for most of these things. I do tend to sterilize sharp sand if I'm going to use it, so it doesn't have too many weed seeds in it, and that just means putting it in an old pan, leaving it on top of the wood burner for an hour and just let it get really hot, and that will kill any weed seeds, I think. Probably not necessary, and it's probably just me being over cautious. But
I suppose is there, obviously we've got a session with you next week, but is there anything around biosecurity, around seeds and sort of pests and diseases that you would be aware of? And obviously that's something you've just mentioned there, but.
Well, yeah, I had the plant passport inspector came about a week ago actually, and he's checking for any notifiable diseases, and he didn't find anything at the nursery, thankfully. You know, you have to be careful of things like fire blight. If you're in a fire blight area, I don't have any experience of it because I don't have it, thankfully. I think it's something you get in apples and hawthorns and things. And he was checking for a new disease that had come in on olive trees, imported olive trees. Or no, it hasn't come in yet, thankfully, but it's quite prevalent in Europe, and they're watching out for it because it can infect prunus species, the cherries and blackthorn species. So yeah, and apart from that, I have a boot wash, which I would have available if people were coming into the nursery in it for any events. And we have things like ash dieback and Phytophthora, the larch disease, which are pretty much endemic to this part of the world now. Sensible biosecurity measures, keeping everything nice and clean. I do notice that the tree planting companies aren't taking back the bags they use. They have these big woven sacks, and they're not taking them back for biosecurity reasons. But it does mean I can use them on the island, and it's not a problem because they're already on the island, and I'm basically putting trees back to where these bags came from at planting schemes on the island.
So you're having to be careful about seed trays then that you use, and sort of the cleaning of those or sterilising of those. Just if you're using them year on year, we just give them a wash, and that's.
I just wash them out with soap, brush them out, let them dry and brush them out, and then give them a wash with some soapy water, maybe with a dash of bleach in it. But yeah, just normal kind of nursery cleanliness. I mean, I'll talk a bit more about pests and diseases next week. Problems for me are vine weevil, which any nursery has, so I spray with a nematode twice a year. But I'll go a bit more into that next week. I don't use any pesticides or fungicides or herbicides, which does create its own problems. You know, big nurseries does use this as a matter of course. So stuff like birch rust can be a bit of a problem, and powdery mildew on oak, and powdery mildews on hawthorns and the roses. Yeah.
Great. So, and you're going to cover that next week. You're going to look at tree nursery techniques, aren't you?
Yeah, I'll cover the. I mean, if anything, there's more to cover next week. Maybe I should have overlapped into that a bit more this week, but I'll cover growing mediums, fertilizers, containers, root trainers, growing in fish boxes or pots or in the open ground, and cover how I do each species and what's involved through the season growing them. Well, my experience anyway.
Great, thanks, Andy. I'm just going to show a couple more slides. I think there's I'm just one last question there.
Say, I see sea buckthorn is not something I've tried yet either, I'm afraid. I know you've got a lot over in your part of the world.
Yeah,
there's
again,
a bit over here, but
yeah, it is a plant. It is a tree that takes over a little bit. So again, I think there's some species that we just sort of plant with caution, and I think sea buckthorn is one of them. So yeah, was there anything, Julie, that you wanted to ask about that? What about sea buckthorn? You have some berries, so yeah, I suppose what we're trying to do with berries when we remove the flesh is just replicate what would be happening in nature, presumably, is that they would be eaten and go through the gut of an animal, and then that's why we're cleaning the flesh off of them, isn't it? It's just to replicate that what would normally have happened in terms of getting rid of the flesh of the seed, so that we've just got just the seed left. So I presume you would do the same for buckthorn. But I'll just signpost some resources actually just for further information as well, and that might help you as well. So bear with me one second. I'm not sure you can hear me okay.
I can hear you now.
Won't be a second. Sorry, I don't know what's happened there. I can't get my sound to work on the other computer. Can you hear me just all right just now?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So I'll just stretch over and reach here. Okay. So so sorry, folks. Just to round us up, actually, there was just a couple of signposts for some tree growing resources. So we'll send you some links to these. This is the Tree Council's Tree Growers Guide, and it actually helpfully talks through all the different species of trees that you might like to grow, majority of them anyway, and about the sort of the techniques for how you would when to gather them and the techniques for treating them, etc. And then the autumn seed harvest book from TCB. As anything you might need to know about community tree planting or growing, or tree maintenance or funding or finding your site or community engagement. So lots of different links here that you can click on. So this is a really useful resource for anyone involved and interested in trees. And if you're looking to work with schools, we've got some specific guidance about how to work with schools, and the sorts of things that young people could do in terms of getting awards as part of their work with trees. And we'll obviously be doing lots of stuff around social media this week because it's Climate Week. So on that, just to round us up, I would love you in the next few minutes of the session, just if you could put in the chat box any climate action pledges that you might be able to commit to. So anything that you could do for climate action over the next year, let's say. So whether that's planting a tree, growing a tree, or doing something around the way that you travel to work, or the things that you could do at home. So it'd be lovely to see any climate action pledges in the chat box there. And Andy and I will be just on the call here for the next sort of 5-10 minutes if you wanted to come on and ask any specific questions that we've not tackled already. And those are my contact details there. And we'll follow up this training session with some information and links as well. So thanks everyone for all your participation. And look forward to seeing you next week if you can make it, or any of the other training that's happening shortly. So thanks a lot.